Emily Hart woke to a sound that did not belong in her house. The dragging came in soft beats, like a body pulled over rough boards. She held her breath and counted the spaces between each scrape. The hallway felt longer than it had yesterday. Shadows pooled where the wall should have ended. Emily said, "Nia, stay in bed," though the room felt empty of answers. She stepped into the corridor, and the cold sharpened her eyes. There was a door where there had only been paint. The knob was dull, like old teeth. Her phone camera showed a blank wall when she tried to take a photo. Emily said, "This is not happening," and pressed her palm to the frame. A whisper came from the seam and spoke her name with a dry smile. The air smelled like rain and copper. Something tapped from the other side, patient and sure. Nia called from her room, asking who was in the hall. Emily said no one, and the whisper repeated her lie. Dawn came like a weak apology that did not change the facts. Emily made coffee and watched the hallway from the kitchen pass through. She measured the corridor with tape and found an extra foot that had no place to be. Mark Ellis arrived with easy humor that died when he saw the frame. Mark said, "I never cut that opening." He traced the trim and shook his head. "The studs should have been there. The blueprint said so." Emily said, "It was not here yesterday." He laughed, and then stopped, because the laugh felt too loud. They both listened. The house answered with the soft pop of settling wood. "Honey." The door did not show on the photo he took either. Mark said, "Must be a glitch," but his eyes searched for exits. Detective Laura Quinn stood in the entry with a small notepad and a harder stare. She asked simple questions and wrote simple words that did not fit the room. Quinn said, "Walk me through last night." Emily told her the sequence and left out nothing. The detective's body cam blinked a red dot and listened. Emily said, "The door will not show on cameras." Quinn raised a brow and filmed the hallway. The live screen showed plaster where wood stood. Quinn said, "That is not how cameras work." The dragging sound came like a slow tide. Quinn swallowed and kept filming. The red dot turned amber and then black. The file died in her hands. Night returned with rain sharper than before. Emily sat on the hall floor with a blanket and a stubborn calm. She placed a strip of painter's tape over the door's seam. She wrote her daughter's name on the tape and then crossed it out. A slow scrape answered like a bad joke. Mia called from her room and asked if the thin man was still hungry. Emily said, "He is not real," and hated the taste of the words. The tape rose a fraction, as if pulled by breath. Emily leaned close and heard the sea in a shell, but colder. The knob turned one click and stopped. The house held its breath with her. Morning brought a visitor from 2 houses down, drawn by the rain and the hush. Evelyn Crane stood in the doorway and did not cross the threshold. Evelyn said, "When a door arrives unasked, learn who invited it." Emily asked what that meant. Evelyn watched the hallway that seemed to flex when named. She told a story about a family that packed fast and left faster. Emily said, "This is my home." Evelyn nodded once and suggested salt for the frame. The old woman's eyes never touched the knob. She left a small jar on the table and walked back into the wet day, lighter by one warning and heavier by memory. Emily Hart decided she would not let the house dictate her fear. She placed her daughter Mia at the kitchen table with crayons and paper, keeping her close as she brewed tea. Her eyes never left the hall. The door stood like a wound stitched into plaster, silent but waiting. Emily taped the frame again, this time with layers of masking tape pressed hard. She said, "It will not move tonight." Her voice carried no conviction. Mia hummed and drew a picture of a tall figure holding hands with a small girl. Emily asked, "Who is that?" Mia said, "He knows my name." The tea kettle whistled, but Emily did not move. The sound felt like alarm. She pulled Mia onto her lap and whispered, "You are safe with me," though she knew safety had no place here anymore. That night, the tape betrayed her. Emily rose at midnight to check the seam and found the strip sliced through in neat diagonal cuts. Dust footprints stretched across the hallway floor and stopped at Mia's room. The prints were too long, too narrow, like no shoe she had ever seen. Her heart tripped as she opened Mia's door. The child slept soundly, curls tangled across the pillow. But the windowsill carried mud, fresh and damp, pressed from the inside. Emily whispered, "No, no," as she traced the marks with trembling hands. The air smelled faintly metallic, like old pennies. She locked the window 3 times and dragged a chair beneath the knob. When she leaned close to Mia, her daughter murmured in sleep, "He's waiting outside." Morning broke with a brittle quiet. Emily called the city office, demanding records of her home. A clerk sent her digitized blueprints within minutes. She printed the pages and spread them across the table. Every line showed the hallway intact, but no door drawn, no space accounted for. She crawled beneath the floorboards, measuring joists and beams. They refused to align with what stood above them. She struck her head against the low rafters and cursed. Her phone light cut across cobwebs and dust, but not the truth. When she climbed out, her hands were black with old dirt. She said aloud, "This house was not built this way." The silence that followed agreed, and it terrified her more than denial. The stranger came without knocking. Jonas Pike leaned on her fence post, like he had always belonged there. His eyes carried the weight of distances unseen. Emily asked, "Do I know you?" Jonas said, "No, but I know the kind of door you found." His voice dragged like gravel. He spoke of thresholds that opened not to rooms but to hungers. Emily laughed once, sharp and brittle. Jonas said some doors don't want to be built. They want to be found. He warned her not to speak names near it. He glanced at Mia through the window, and his jaw tightened. Emily demanded, "Why are you here?" Jonas replied, "Because someone has to map the places that eat families." Then he turned, leaving the scent of rain and rust in his wake. That evening, the latch carried a new stain. Emily spotted the faint outline of rust creeping from the metal plate, blooming like blood into the grain. Mia had cut her finger earlier while sharpening a crayon, and Emily remembered the drop that fell too near the door. She pressed her thumb over the knob and felt the chill pulse back into her hand. The lock shifted a fraction farther than before, though she had not turned it. Emily whispered, "It knows her," and pulled her daughter close. Mia asked, "Do we let him in?" Emily shook her head and fought tears. The house seemed to sigh. Wood groaning like an unseen weight leaned against it, testing the hinges, waiting for the right name to be spoken again. Emily Hart sat in the dark hallway with her back against the wall. The house was silent until a voice rose faint and steady. It was her own voice, echoing from behind the door. Each word came seconds before she thought it. The echo spoke a sentence she had not yet formed, twisting time into a cruel riddle. Emily said, "Stop copying me," but the whisper replied with the same phrase just before she spoke it. Her skin crawled as if the air itself were rehearsing her fears. She pressed her palm to the seam, and the boards thrummed like a heartbeat. Mia stirred in her room and asked if Emily was talking to someone. Emily answered, "No one," though the word came a beat too late, already whispered from the other side. By dawn, the walls cracked like ice. Thin lines spread across the plaster, spiderwebbing from the frame outward. Emily touched the fractures, and her fingertips felt cold frost along the groove. Mia whispered to someone unseen, giggling with an odd calm. Emily rushed into her room. Mia sat cross-legged on the floor, speaking softly to the corner. Emily said, "Who are you talking to?" Mia answered, "The thin man knows things about you." She recited details Emily had never told her, memories of childhood winters and hidden secrets. Emily pulled her daughter close, trembling at how the house now used Maya's voice as its own instrument. Detective Laura Quinn returned that evening, her skepticism stretched thin but not gone. She walked the hallway, body cam steady on her chest. Emily stood silent as the dragging sound rose again, louder than before. Quinn froze, her eyes darting to Emily. The camera blinked red, then stuttered. The recorded sound collapsed into a slow, heavy heartbeat, erasing the thuds. Quinn played it back, and the distorted pulse filled the air, unnatural and slow. She said, "I heard it clear," but her device offered only silence and static. For the first time she looked unsure, gripping her notepad too tight, her jaw clenched against fear she could not rationalize. Later, Mark Ellis appeared at the door uninvited, his face pale beneath work dust. He carried rolled papers under his arm. Emily asked, "Why are you here?" Mark said, "I need those blueprints back." His hands shook as he explained that another family once had the same trouble. He muttered about walls shifting, clients disappearing. Emily pressed him for names, but he stayed silent. His eyes darted toward the hallway, as if waiting for permission. Emily saw sweat trace his temple despite the cool night. She realized then he knew more than he claimed, and his silence was not protection but guilt. Near midnight, the door shook for the first time. Emily braced herself against the handle as it twisted under her grip. A hand pressed from the other side, long fingers straining through the gap. The skin was gray, cold as ice against hers. She cried out and shoved back, feeling nails scrape along her palm. The seam widened enough to show the hollow dark beyond, then slammed shut with a thunderous knock. Mia screamed from her room, and silence fell as if the house held its breath. Emily collapsed against the frame, shaking, her skin marked with thin red welts where the thing had touched her. Evelyn Crane invited Emily inside her cluttered parlor, the air heavy with the scent of dried flowers and dust. She poured tea with trembling hands and told Emily of another house decades ago. Evelyn said, "My sister had a door like yours." She described how her niece vanished one night, and the family fled, never speaking of it again. Emily listened, her throat tight, realizing this horror had stalked others before her. Evelyn said, "They come for children, always for children." Her voice cracked with memory. Emily gripped her cup until her nails bit into porcelain. She whispered, "Then I cannot let it take her." Evelyn's eyes closed, a silent agreement written in sorrow. Emily searched old town records at the public library, pages brittle beneath her fingertips. She found black and white photos of her house before it was renovated. One image showed the hallway, but where the door now stood was only blank plaster. Another record was stranger, a faint outline, a shadowed rectangle drawn in ink that had no explanation. She whispered, "It has always been there." Her stomach knotted at the thought. She copied the files and folded them into her coat. The silence of the reading room pressed around her, oppressive as if the books themselves disapproved of what she uncovered. Jonas Pike cornered Mark Ellis outside the diner, slamming rolled blueprints against his chest. Jonas said, "You knew what you built." Mark stammered that he was only paid to ignore measurements that made no sense. Jonas revealed an old invoice signed by someone calling himself the Threshold Man. Mark's eyes darted away, ashamed. Emily watched from across the lot, her trust unraveling. She realized Mark had seen this before and said nothing. The betrayal burned deeper than fear. Mark whispered, "He promised me my brother's life." Jonas spat on the ground, disgusted at the price of silence. Emily taped her daughter's name to the frame, thinking it might seal it out. But as she whispered Mia's full name near the wood, the grain seemed to ripple, curling toward her lips like an ear listening. She froze, heart racing. The tape darkened, as if absorbing the word. The door pulsed once, a soundless throb. Emily ripped the tape away and cursed herself for speaking. She realized too late that the door did not need strength, it needed names, and names were invitations. She pressed her back to the wall, clutching Mia's stuffed fox for courage, the wood seeming to vibrate with a mocking hunger. The lullaby began just after midnight, soft and sweet, in Emily's own voice. Mia stirred and rose, her small hand reaching toward the knob. Emily lunged, grabbing her before she touched it. The door exhaled a cold breath, as if disappointed. When Emily pulled Mia back, a lock of her daughter's hair remained caught in the jam, clamped tight by the wood. Emily screamed, tugging the hair free, but it stayed behind. The door seemed to hum, satisfied by even that small piece of her child. Emily clutched Mia against her chest, shaking, while the house creaked with a slow, satisfied rhythm like something feeding. Emily searched the attic for strength and found a box of old notebooks instead. The covers smelled of dust and old glue. Inside were crayons pressed hard into paper, each page a doorway with a black mouth. Emily said, "I drew this," and her voice shrank. She traced the knob she used to fear in dreams. Pictures showed a hallway that was not this house, yet wore its bones. A date in childish print matched winters she barely remembered. Mia climbed the steps and asked what the pictures meant. Emily said, "They mean I have seen it before." The air turned colder, as if the pages had opened a window. The roof creaked like a held breath. Emily closed the box and felt the house lean closer to listen. The farmhouse called to her through memory, like a road she had avoided. Emily drove past fields that wore snow like thin ash. The house stood roof bent, windows blinded by grime. Emily said, "I know this place," and the wind carried it back. She found a county record stapled to the porch post, a warning from years ago. The name on the notice matched her family line. She stepped inside, and the floor groaned its welcome. The long corridors smelled of damp wood and iron. At the end, a rectangle darker than dark breathed without moving. Emily whispered her own name, and the echo answered with a child's cry from before she was born. Jonas met her at the gate with a face that knew the cost. He held a notebook filled with strange maps and tighter notes. Jonas said, "Thresholds hunt blood, not bricks." He spoke of names as keys shaped by lineage. Emily said, "It wants Mia." Jonas nodded once. He told her of families marked by accidents that were never accidents. The door did not arrive. It remembered. Emily held the fence and steadied her breath. Jonas said, "If the name is spoken near the wood, it grows teeth." The wind lifted dead grass and set it whispering. Emily felt the words she was not allowed to say burn her tongue. Mark waited in his truck behind the diner, eyes raw from nights without sleep. He handed Emily a crumpled invoice stained with coffee rings. Mark said, "I was paid to ignore the measurements." The signature belonged to a name that looked like a joke until it was not. Emily asked, "Who promised you a miracle?" Mark stared at his hands and said, "A man who knew too much about hospitals." He spoke of a brother fading in a bed of white noise. The deal was time bought with silence. Emily's anger arrived like clean fire. Mark said, "I did not think it would choose her." The wind snapped the paper and made the lie sound thin. Evelyn called with a voice that shook like a screen door in wind. She remembered a child taken from a different home years ago. Emily said, "That was meant for me." The words hurt more than the truth. Evelyn confirmed a mix-up on a winter night, 2 houses with 1 hunger. The door had waited and found her again. Emily stood in her hallway and saw it as a hunter that learned her scent. Mia slept in the next room, unaware of the trade that had been proposed by fate and fear. Emily said, "It follows blood until the debt is paid." The knob clicked once, like a yes. She placed both palms on the frame and promised the wood it would choke on her name first. Storm clouds split the sky, thunder rolling like the earth itself growled. Rain lashed against glass until the windows shook. Emily Hart stood in the hallway, lantern trembling in her hand. The door flexed as if it breathed, panels bowing inward and releasing bursts of freezing air. She whispered, "It is trying to come through." The seams groaned with the sound of old timber breaking. Mia whimpered from her room, and Emily said, "Stay back." The dragging noise rose again, louder than ever, a chorus of weight being pulled across unseen floors. The knob rattled violently, and shadows pressed through the cracks like black smoke, searching for a body. Jonas Pike arrived, soaked to the bone, his notebook clutched tight under his coat. He spoke urgently, "Thresholds barter in names. They will not stop until they are fed." Emily demanded, "Then how do we fight it?" Jonas said, "You must give it a name it cannot consume." He warned that to enter its world was to risk never leaving, but if ignored it would claim Mia piece by piece. Emily said, "I will never give her up." Jonas' eyes burned with pity. He laid salt lines at the base of the door and whispered words that sounded older than language. The wood hissed in reply, seams twitching as if angry to be restrained. Emily's hand trembled as she gripped the knob. She whispered, "If it wants me, then I will step through." The door yawned open onto a corridor that was not her home, but a rotting farmhouse, ribs of wood bending inward. The walls breathed, boards curling like flesh. Mia's voice echoed faintly from the dark, calling for her mother. Emily stepped forward, heart pounding, as Jonas muttered behind her that she must not linger. The air smelled of rot and iron. The corridor stretched longer the farther she walked, doors on either side whispering her name in unison. The threshold man appeared at the corridor's end, tall and thin, face stretched into a grin that split too wide. His voice slithered, trade her name for his life. He gestured toward Mark Ellis, who stood bound in shadow, eyes wet with terror. Emily's pulse thundered, realizing the creature offered an exchange. She said, "You cannot have her." The entity stepped closer, limbs too long, joints bending wrong. Emily carved her own name into the wood with a pocket knife, blood smearing the letters. She shouted, "Take me instead." The walls shuddered, boards splitting as the door screamed in fury. Detective Laura Quinn pulled Mia back through the doorway as Jonas poured salt into the seam. Emily slammed the door on the threshold man's reaching arm. It burst into splinters of black dust that scattered across the floor. Emily screamed with effort as the door sealed, trapping her name inside. The house trembled, plaster raining from the ceiling. For one terrible second, silence reigned, then the frame held steady. Jonas said, "You bound it to yourself." Emily's chest burned, a faint red scar forming in the shape of a keyhole over her sternum. She collapsed, clutching Mia, as the storm outside died to a whisper. Morning crept in thin and gray, as if the storm had taken the color with it. Emily Hart woke on the couch, with Mia pressed to her side, and the house listening. The door looked like ordinary plaster again, smooth and bland, pretending innocence. Emily rose slowly, feeling the ache of a night wrestled against wood and hunger. Jonas stood at the threshold with a weary nod, saying nothing that could make it smaller. Emily touched her chest and found a tender keyhole-shaped scar, warm under her palm. Mia asked if the bad dream was over. Emily said, "We are here because it was the only truth that did not break." The kettle clicked on, and even that small sound felt like a promise struggling to stand. By noon, the quiet felt staged. Emily walked the hallway and counted the breaths between creaks. Mark Ellis never answered his phone. His truck sat 2 streets over with the bed dusted in fresh sawdust, damp as if it had sweated fear. Emily stood beside it and tasted rain in the air, remembering the offer the door had made. She thought of debts that chose their own collectors. A crow barked from a wire and startled her into motion. She left a note beneath the wiper and turned back toward home, unwilling to look into the cab. The silence inside the truck was a wall she would not climb. Not today. Detective Laura Quinn returned with paperwork that would never find a shelf. She stood in the kitchen and spoke like someone who had misplaced their certainty. Quinn said the report would be written, and then it would be lost. She placed a small burner phone on the table and slid it toward Emily. Quinn said, "Call if the wall becomes a door again." Her hands shook once, then steadied with stubborn pride. Emily nodded and thanked her without mentioning belief. "Well," the house seemed to lean away from Quinn, offended by her courage. When the detective left, the kettle hissed like a judgment, and the day folded back into its uneasy quiet. Evening carried the smell of wet leaves and warnings. Evelyn Crane arrived with salt in a jar and sorrow in her eyes. She stood on the porch and spoke about debts that did not forgive, only recalculated. Evelyn said, "They wait until the house forgets you, and then they knock again." Emily listened and did not argue with a truth that had already scarred her. She asked how long they had before the next interest came due. Evelyn did not answer. She pressed the jar into Emily's hands and told her to draw a circle at every bedpost. The porch light hummed like a tired insect, while the sky turned the color of bruised fruit. They left that night, a small motel hours away, the kind with thin towels and thicker silence. Nia slept quickly, worn out by fear and relief. Emily washed her face and stared into the mirror until her own eyes looked borrowed. The wallpaper behind her was plain beige, flat and safe. A hairline seam rose in the reflection, subtle as a crack in ice. She turned fast, and the wall was smooth. The mirror held the seam a moment longer, then a faint round swell like a knob pressed from the other side. A rasping whisper shaped her name with patient delight. The light flickered once, and the room remembered to be cold.